You can open the mountain.vue scene from the project content directory from the training in order to open up the scene I currently have. It's just a very basic scene. It has just a procedural terrain that I designed. And what we're going to do is work with this terrain and modify it with the different tools available within the terrain editor and take a look at some more advanced features. First thing you'll notice is that the terrain is not square. So what I want to do before I make any further changes, especially convert this to a standard terrain, is even out the pixel amount. So what we can do is go to the Resize Terrain option, which is right next to the divide and multiply, and we're going to enter a new terrain size 512 by 256, and we're going to select to resample the altitudes to fit the new terrain. We don't want to cut anything out. We want to use the current fractal and just kind of fill in that information. So that looks a lot better now. It's not so stretched out. So now we can also go and use the multiply and times 2 in order to increase the resolution. If you're going to be stepping up a couple of resolutions and not just going up one, let's say you wanted to bring this all the way up to 4096 by 2048. Well, you wouldn't want to hit times 2 to get to that point because you have to wait for the OpenGL to refresh. So you can go back into the Resize Terrain and just specify your max amount. I'm going to go ahead and just keep this resolution, and we're going to now convert this from a procedural into a standard. So we can go up to the upper left and select standard. So it's just going to convert it over. And one thing I forgot to do before switching it to a standard was to reset the 2D sculpting. Since I didn't actually make any changes except change the scale, it's a good idea to reset that. So I did go back, reset it, and now we're seeing it as a standard terrain. So I'm going to go ahead and save another version of this file so that we can still go back to the procedural version if needed. Now I'm going to go ahead and save this as mountain_standards terrain. There's a couple of options here that are really important for performance. Incorporate texture maps and compress file. What they will do is, if you have any texture maps you've loaded in, they will be saved with this scene as part of it. Compress file creates a smaller file, so something that would be maybe 2 gigs would be down to maybe 1 gig, but it increases the time it takes to write the file. So if you choose to, say, compress the file and you have backups and autosave turned on, every time it goes to autosave, it's going to take a really long time to compress. And the more objects you have in the scene, if you have ecosystems, it can really slow things down. Incorporate texture maps is a good final point for a scene, but while you're working on it, to begin with, I definitely suggest having that off. Just keep everything kind of local, synchronized to your computer's content. If you were going to send it to a render farm or across a network that is not using the same content directories, then you'd want to incorporate those texture maps and make sure that everything was included. So we're going to go ahead and save that, making sure that those 2 options are off, because I do have my options, file options, auto-saving every 5 minutes. So every 5 minutes we would be severely slowed down if it was set to compression, especially if we had a lot of different objects in the scene. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and double-click or select the Edit Object command, open up the terrain editor. Now, if you want to change the color gradient that's showing for the terrain, you can actually do that on the bottom a couple of different ways. You could edit the color map, and this is what's creating the height for the terrain. You can also double-click to open up the color map browser and the visual browser for all of the color maps included, or any that you might have created yourself or purchased. If you go to the terrain editor maps, there's quite a few to choose from. So if you want to go ahead and change let's go to the green, brown, white, and we're really not seeing a lot of detail just because there aren't nearly as many key points in this. So what we can do is move these keys and you can see that does update in the terrain editor, which is really nice. This will also change for the procedural output observer, although it won't be exact. So you can use that as an aid if you want. You can also reset it. We can start with a new one. I'm going to go back and load in the Green Canyon, which I believe is the default. Close enough to it. So we're going to go ahead and start taking a look at the erosion effects. So in the Effects tab, these are effects that will only manipulate the 2D layer. In the erosion effects, we have diffusive, thermal, glaciation, wind, dissolve, alluvium, fluvial, and river valley. Now, a cool thing about these is one thing we can do is, well, let's go ahead and use the alluvium. And the more of an impact we want to have on the terrain, we can change the rock hardness. Now you can just click and hold it down and it will continually apply the effect, which is pretty cool. We can see that erosion showing up around the edges. Another thing we can do is right click in order to enter an iteration count. So let's go ahead and run this 6 times and click OK. Then we can see it processing. So we can go through all of those and run them numerous times, set certain amounts. You can also record macros this way. The only one I really suggest you don't use an iteration count for is River Valley, because it takes so long to process. I would highly suggest really just playing around with the different effects and seeing exactly what they do and what you can get out of them. There are definitely cool combinations, really interesting, useful ones, but it really depends on the terrain and the features that you're trying to affect. The effects can also apply materials, which is pretty cool. So I'm going to go ahead and just X out of that and get back to the state I was in before. I'm also going to go ahead and just create a snapshot of the scene at this point. You can always go back to previous snapshots or autosaves depending on if the file is saved or not. If the file hasn't been saved yet, you'll see a lot more snapshots. So we're going to go ahead and add in some new materials. And I'm going to go ahead and select from the landscapes. And I'm going to pick the rock and grass preset. And mine might look a little different than yours because I did go through with mine and update the terrain preview. or the material preview to look like a terrain and resaved them out. And I can show you how you can manipulate those previews in just a minute once we get into the material editor. So when you add a material layer through the terrain editor as opposed to adding a layer within the material editor, you need to paint on the area in order for the alpha to show up. So right now we have only the default material showing, which is underneath, because we need to paint in that material for the rock and grass. Now if I was to add this through, what we can do is even just delete this material and add it through the material editor, going to new layer, and then we can see that new rock and grass. And we have up at the top the overall material name for this layer in this group of layers. I'll just call it mountain. And now we should see the rock and grass. And we'll go ahead and select the paint material brush. And what we're going to see is a solid color of whatever the overall color is. Every material generates an overall color. So it's a combination of, or a collective of the areas of color throughout the entire material. So you can use this overall color to do a little fine-tuning on the color just a bit. We could make it a little bit darker, or we could maybe adjust the hue. And just a very quick change of the overall color will change the entire material and add sort of a filter over it. So now we have this showing and covering up that default surface that's underneath. We could also remove the default surface and we wouldn't need an alpha. But if you did want to replace that later, it might be good to have. So now if we want to paint on this, we would actually need to subtract if we were to remove these areas and want to show the default. So with the paint material, we set it to invert. And it's a little difficult to see the change because the colors are so close to each other. So if I went ahead and took that default material, just right-clicking, edit color, and make it a little darker, then you'd be able to see a lot better where this other area is being subtracted from. So if you add it through the material editor, you need to subtract in order to define where it's showing. But if you add it from the terrain editor, then you need to paint in where it's going to show. So that does make it a little easier to create like a quick mask. So I do want to show you the material effects and how those work. So we will need to essentially reset this. What I'm going to do is delete this rock and grass and re-add it through the terrain editor, but first I'm going to copy the overall color. So right click and select copy so we can preserve that. So we'll just go ahead and delete that layer. And now what it did was it has a default, and now it's adding a default rock, and that's because the last material, or the last brush I had selected, was the paint material brush. So what we can do is switch to the raise brush and just cancel that and reopen it, and now we're back to just that default material. So we can add a new layer, rock and grass, and I'm going to go ahead and paste that overall color. So now I'm going to, with the paint material brush selected, go to the effects and select apply material to effect. So what I can do is you can apply and run a variety of the effects over the terrain, and the material is showing up. It's a little hard to see. Material effects really end up being about half of the total effect. So you really have to apply it several times to get something really dark or really defined. That'll also depend on your resolution, because your material maps or the alphas that are being generated from painting, or in this case applying the effects, are going to be the same scale as the terrain scale and that terrain pixel resolution. So if you need more detail, you will need to increase the resolution of the terrain. And I'm going to go ahead to that default surface, and what we can do is double click while in the advanced material editor. If you're not sure how to get to the advanced material editor, and we skip this step, by default the basic material used to show, but in more recent versions of Vue, now the advanced material editor should show up right away. There is a basic material editor which just gives you a color map, bump map, transparency map. Very straightforward, really simple, easy for editing plants. But all the really good features are in the advanced material editor. So what I'm going to do is double click on the material preview for the default, and now we can switch this with a different material. Switch to, let's say, grass variations. It looks like I'll probably need to increase the scale of the material. Now an easy way to tell where a surface is by using the material layer highlighter. Every layer has a highlighter, and what you can do is change, just go ahead and click on the little highlighter icon, and then we could right click and select a color that will show up, something a little more violet in this case. You can see that starting to show. And the main problem, I think, with this terrain is just that the resolution is probably too low, which is why those small little cracks aren't really filling in with too much of the material. But you can start to see where that material is showing up. It's definitely the scale of the texture. You can also access the highlighters within the Materials tab on the World browser. So you can turn on and off those options in here as well. So we can bring that back to where we were. And if we want, go back to the paint, select that rock and grass, and it looks like it might have changed the overall material when I did the highlighter. Either that or turning it on and off in the World browser currently might not be working. I'll just go ahead and paste my other color back in because that still is saved in the memory. But if we go to our other effects, if we go ahead and add stones, we can see the material showing up a lot better. terraces. We could sharpen it, and we'll start to see little bits of the material showing there. Now there's something else I want to show you regarding the material. And what we can do is, if we want to affect everything except the painted area, and I'm also going to go ahead and just double the terrain resolution. And it looks like, because the terrain isn't square, that it is severely affecting the division, the way this looks. I have noticed before that the resolution is backwards in the way you put in the X and the Y, and it does end up affecting everything else in the way it calculates the division. So I think I'm going to have to bring this back to square. So we'll go ahead and set this to 1024 by 1024. And now all those strange artifacts are going away. So I'm going to go ahead and double the resolution again, and we'll just run a few more effects on this to kind of fill in and improve with the new resolution. And then we're going to take a look at freezing the material layer. Okay, so what we can do is, there's an icon right next to the color for the material layer. If you click on it once, it'll hide the layer. If you click on it again, it freezes, which means that we can only affect everything else. So we're going to switch to the Resize brush. And just set a minimal flow, turn off the invert. And what we can see is we're affecting everything except that material layer. So if we do invert it, we can push down the areas around those features and those rocks. And it looks like that material is still a little too low res. So we're going to go back to the paint material, go ahead and change our fall off, increase our fall off, increase our flow, turn off invert, go to effects, apply material to effect, and let's go ahead and run a few here. And it might not be a bad idea to have the resolution and then apply our material effect. And I just went ahead and ran a bunch of the effects to really kind of increase the impact. We're going to go back and freeze that once again. And you can see a lot more showing up. So we could also use some of the other brushes if we want to switch over to 3D Sculpt. So we'll use the Inflate tool, and if we invert it, we can deflate. Now, next to the size, flow, and fall off, and next to the actual number output, the slider, there's a little drive with pressure box that you can turn on in order to enable pressure-sensitive tablets to control that. Now, actually, it looks like a deflate. It's not a good idea in this case. We'll go through here. And it looks like it maybe created too many polygons. One thing that's really nice, and I'm going to go ahead and just undo the sculpting for now. What we can do is limit the bandwidth. In other words, how many subdivisions we create. Because when you start sculpting in 3D, the smaller the brush you have and you're using, the more geometry is going to be needed in order to create a feature that size. So sometimes if you're facing the terrain from a different angle than one section you were working on, you go to another, or something will jump closer when you were working on something far away, it'll subdivide and create a really high resolution portion of the terrain that might not need to be that high. So when we set the bandwidth, we can choose our layer, and it looks like 8 million is going to be the minimum because of the scale of this terrain. But what we can do is adjust which layer we're working on and what resolution. So right now, I'm not working or painting with the full 8 million. I'm really working with a lower resolution layer, just kind of bulging out some of those areas. So if we want to increase the level we're working with, we can set it to 1. And actually, we'll go ahead and, if we turn that off, we should be able to work with something a little better. And it looks like that's just because we really only have one layer of detail. And actually, I might go ahead and reduce the resolution. And I did just go ahead and reset the 3D sculpting. It did actually crash the program. So just kind of went back a step or two. Switch over to the Inflate brush and start working with the 3D. And I think the reason why we're working, or what we see, is just a lower amount of the resolution of the terrain being manipulated is because of the freeze. You'll probably get a much better resolution. We just want to check it. It does look a little bit better, but for the most part, it's the preview of it is limited. So we're going to go back and we can freeze that. So it's just a cool way to create interesting things kind of going around certain material areas. I'm going to go ahead and just turn off the freeze layer. We can take a look at some of the other sculpting we can do. I am going to go back and actually revert to a previous version without that initial erosion effect added. So what I'm going to do is go into the terrain. I do need to set that scale to be higher. And then we don't have a material on it anymore, so we can load in the rock and grass. It's just kind of a base layer. Now, if you're planning to only work with the 3D geometry, there is a way you can convert this terrain to be only the 3D sculpted layer. So the 2D layer becomes flat then. It'll give you a lot more control over the normal directions and a little more power over these other sculpting tools. So what it is they're retopologize. And the higher this setting is, the smoother the terrain is going to end up. So we can use a smaller value, say 0.5, and it's just going to convert that over to a 3D sculpted version. So now there's no more 2D layer, we only have a 3D layer, which also means that the effects won't really work anymore. I can run these filters all day and it won't do any good because it only affects the 2D layer. But now we do have something that's more compatible with the other brushes. I think it ends up working to your advantage in most cases. So we can go over to a different brush, say the flatten brush. And go ahead and increase our flow a bit. And with the flatten brush, what I want to do is actually take a fall off filter from the altitude, and that's with the brushes panel open. I go over to flatten and paste in that fall off filter. And that works more like the traditional unislope brush that was part of Vue 9. So we can also adjust the fall off. And then if we want to manipulate some of the smaller layers, we can adjust the bandwidth. And now we start working with the smaller resolutions. And if you have to undo something, you can just go up to the top. We can also use I'm not going to save the brush. I'm going to go to the 3D sculptor because I want to show you the difference between some of the different modes here for directions. The 3D Sculpt brush by default has freeform turned off. So what's going to happen is the first time you click on the terrain to start sculpting, and that was way too high of a flow. I'm going to turn that down. Even that might be a bit high. Adjust the fall off. We'll go ahead and shift and double click and view that area a little better. Okay, so once we click for the first time, that direction stays constant. So what it does is it grabs from the direction of the normal that it's touching at first, and it continues in that direction the whole time you're sculpting. Now, if you want it to change as the normal changes, you can turn on the Freeform mode. Freeform will conform to the current normal and constantly evaluate the slope and the direction and allow you to paint in all those different directions. And if you want to push in, and what I'm going to do in this case is turn off Freeform, we can just turn on Invert. And then we can push in the terrain and the geometry there. Remembering that first it grabs its direction and then it starts to continually apply that. If we want to smooth out some of these areas, mostly the jagged areas, we're going to set the limit bandwidth to 0 with the smooth brush. And that'll allow us to smooth out just that top level of geometry that's really jagged. While keeping most of the features there. So that we can kind of step through with the bandwidth and increase it higher and higher. Typically you want to use an integer, a whole number. Going back to the 3D Sculpt Brush. What I also want to do is turn on a mask. So I'm going to load in one of the brushes from the Terrain and Landscape brush kit available from Resize Effects. And there are samples of the collection included with the training, so you can load those in. I'm going to be using the PSD version and one of the rock slabs. So what I can do now with the mask, and I do have the option set to don't subdivide. It will subdivide based on the texture resolution. So this is a way to just get a minimal effect from the brush or the alpha. And then if we want to increase the resolution, we can subdivide up to a certain amount of polygons. So if we limit our bandwidth to, let's say, 2, we shouldn't subdivide or increase the resolution at all, just kind of manipulate what we already have. If we do need more detail, we can remove the limit. So we can basically increase the subdivision level to as high as it'll let us go. And then just control the max amount of resolution we're getting or affecting with the limit bandwidth. So if we go ahead and set this up to 3, and we should be getting further into the detail level. And if you want to check the resolution, you can open up the Wireframe mode. And that'll really show you when something becomes subdivided. And go ahead and invert that, and make a smaller brush. And we can go ahead and drive that with pressure as well. But we'll have to start out with something a little larger. And maybe that's not going to work out too well for the size at the moment. Might be because of the airbrush mode or the inversion. One of the best ways to invert is to invert the image for the mask and then invert the actual brush. And that's one of the best ways to get the detail out of it. Because the fall off is still going around the edge properly then, and you can still get the right details. Depending on the resolution and the quality of your video card, once you start getting up to 20, 30 million polygons, the wireframe mode is pretty heavy on resources. So we can also rotate our mask and our texture mask. There's a couple of different rotation options to go over it. And if we want, we can double click and load in a new texture. I'll go ahead and use one of the cracks. Use number 7. Because you can do some pretty interesting things with this. Go ahead and load in one of the circle alphas, brushes. And that's just going to give us a kind of a varied edge. Which is kind of nice. Another thing you can do is run the tile mask. And what that's going to do is spread out the texture throughout the entire terrain and kind of lock it to the camera. And what you can do is adjust the scale and then you have just those active zones defined by a tiling texture. And creates kind of a cool mask. So you can get some interesting effects this way depending on the type of image you use. Go ahead and switch to one of my erosion brushes. Which adds a lot of nice elements to the bottom. So a cool thing we can do with this is to start with one size and gradually kind of change that size larger or smaller. So if we bring it up to 0.5 for the scale, we can come in, bring in some larger details. If we want to make it even bigger, and the size of these are on average about 1024 by 1024. Some of them are larger. But it should work pretty well for most terrains. And then if you need to offset it, you can just type in the X and Y values. And it looks like we're going a little bit beyond the resolution of the image, so we can limit the bandwidth to avoid the pixelation. Maybe we need to just scale it down a little bit. I'll do 1.5. And we can bring our bandwidth up to, say, 4. And get even more detail. And then if we want, we can just turn off that tile mask. And then we can just paint it in with a single brush. Go ahead and rotate it. Now there's a little bit of strangeness going on. It wasn't showing in the material or in the terrain editor, but looks like it's going to be an issue probably from when I had that image up a little too large. So one thing we could do, just kind of a quick thing we could do, is to go to the retopologize and set that to a really small amount. Let's try 0.1 and see if we can get rid of that. Not quite. So we can bring it in a little further. Trying not to lose our detail. It's just a lot faster than going through and brushing everything, and it is getting better looking. So we can take care of a lot of the stuff that way, if you run into that problem, and then you can clean up things near the camera as needed. The best thing to do for that would be to show the terrain within the scene so we can see where the camera is at. We can turn that off. And then we want to go to the smooth brush, and we're going to limit the bandwidth to 4, which should be the lowest amount. Oh, might need to go down possibly further in order to get rid of those jagged parts. What we can also do is go from underneath the terrain. That can be helpful. If you want to increase the size and just brush the whole terrain really quick with a very large brush, that'll work too, but you kind of lose some of your detail. It really depends on how much cleanup you want to do. So I'd say avoid very large masks if the resolution isn't quite there. Now, before I had said you should limit your bandwidth to integer numbers. That's not entirely correct. What we're going to do now is smooth the higher levels of the terrain. I'm going to grab the smooth brush, and we're going to go to limit bandwidth. And what we're going to do now is use some in-between values. So we can type in 0.25 and just a little bit more, 0.5. We can type in 0.8, 1.25,